Oh, shit. I'm Harvey Bodega, and this is the review of Blades of Exile. Blades of Exile is an independent, open-world, turn-based fantasy role-playing game created by Jeff Vogel of Spiderweb Software and released in 1998. With only 2 developers on the game's credits, Blades of Exile was released and circulated as independent shareware, where a portion of the game was released for free, while the full version had 2 other scenarios and a scenario editor. So you're looking at the game now. The graphics are terrible, and the lack of full-screen support makes playing this game on a modern system rather frustrating. I remember it sort of ran in this full-screen window thing even back in the day on my family's brick computer. That being said, I absolutely love Blades of Exile for what it does well, even though it may be asking a lot of people to overlook some of its glaring faults. Even for the era, the graphics are extremely rudimentary. The world, despite being vast with many interesting areas, has a lot of the same repeating tile types. As for character models, each individual only has one standing sprite and an attacking/interacting sprite. This does not change for equipment worn or type of weapon used, so the sprites are often mismatched from the combat type. Okay, so the graphics are terrible. What about music? This is it. There is no music in this game except when you fire it up. General sound is a different story, as first of all, it exists, although barely. Rudimentary, sound effects are never layered over each other and seem pretty stock, but this soundscape is one of the things that I absolutely love about this game. They can get a little grating to some people, I'm sure, but I think they're just varied enough to be enjoyable, maybe in a humorous, cheesy way. I'll have to check my nostalgia at the door, however, as I know they're low budget, but I would love a modern game with Blades of Exile sound effects. So graphics and sound are 2 things that Blades of Exile does very poorly, but I'd like to shift to something a little bit more positive. How is Blades of Exile played? Those who played PC RPGs of this era will be reminded about how gigantic the user interfaces were. You have your world screen, you have your interactable options, your character information, and associated inventory. So you either use the arrow keys or the mouse to move, and right-click to interact on most objects. Not all mechanics work this way. For instance, post-battle looting, you have to select the loot key, but if you want to loot a dresser, you can just walk up to it and simply right-click on it. There are some controls that you can deselect by right-clicking, while others require you to click back on the skill button to cancel. That being said, I've always found the controls and user interface fairly intuitive and thankfully not overly tedious from a modern perspective. Dialogue involves a very small set of pre-selected questions or relies on you to click on the words within a character's speech to ask more about that subject. There is also the Ask About option, which I have rarely used or rarely found successful. It can be a chore if you need specific information from an NPC and don't know what word to click on or what specifically to ask about. It's honestly a cool alternative to a dialogue wheel or a preset dialogue option, and maybe this could be explored and expanded in a different game, but it's barely functional in Blades of Exile. Combat, which is a huge portion of the game, is fairly intuitive and mostly fun. Upon selecting the combat option, or when an enemy aggresses upon you, your party breaks into individual character models rather than being lifted under one stack. This is a mostly great system for balancing exploration and combat mechanics, but sometimes breaking into combat mode in tight corridors or when enemies are approaching from multiple angles can put non-frontline characters in danger, like mages or archers. Upon entering combat mode, each character gets their own individual turn and can attack or interact accordingly. The exploration buttons on the toolbar are replaced by combat skills. What characters can do on each turn is limited by action points, which corresponds to the weight of equipment worn and several statistics. To attempt a melee attack, simply click in the direction where there's an enemy and an attempt will be made. For a ranged character with equipped bows and arrows or equipped projectile weapons, simply select the projectile key and click on the enemy within range. This system is almost the same for casters, except that they select the school of magic, then the spell from the magic menu, and then on the applicable enemy or ally. As for magic users, there are 2 types, mages and priests. Mages have the most offensive elemental magic, while priests have more buffs, debuffs, and healing spells. The entire friendly party takes their turns in order, and when the entire party's turns are over, the enemies take their turns in rapid succession. Sometimes this fast speed can be a little bit chaotic, resulting in difficulty in knowing the enemy's exact location, so you can slow it down in the game settings if you want. but I think it makes Blades of Exile's breed of turn-based combat more dynamic, fast-paced, and simply more fun. It's not perfect, but it cuts out much of the tedium that most turn-based combat systems suffer from even today. There is a bit of a balance issue when comparing melee, ranged, and magic-using characters. Magic users are by far the most powerful, versatile, and fun to play. Compare this to this. Magic has incredible diversity, status effects, and can really open up some interesting strategy and roleplay opportunities. So that's great, but melee characters, although vitally important for a tanky frontline and can deal great damage at higher levels, can be mundane in comparison. At least they're better than full archer or ranged characters, though. And in order to show why, we need to talk about inventory management. The way that system works in Blades of Exile is that each character has a weight carrying capacity, and every item, including armor, weapons, projectiles, etc., has a weight stat. When picking up loot, there's a handy menu to select who picks up which item, although once picked up, it's a little bit more tedious to move items between characters. Blades of Exile takes advantage of the large user interface to make it not a complete chore, although, like with any system with limits, there can be frustration. There are a few ways to increase carrying capacity, the main one being the strength statistic. This is what creates issues for archers, as both the accuracy and damage of ranged weapons is dependent on a character's dexterity stat, along with either the archery or throwing skill. This means that a full archer character is likely going to have a very low strength, so after armor, there will not be a ton of room in a character's inventory for arrows. This often requires a high-strength character having to carry extra arrows for the archer character, and they'll likely still run out before finishing most dungeons. Despite certain types of characters being less viable than others, the balance of combat and enemy encounters tends to be very fair, and although a few fights will be quite easy, others might be engagingly difficult. That's enough about gameplay, though. Let's get into the story of the game, and don't worry, there will not be any spoilers. So to make this confusing, before I get to the story in the game, I want to start with the story of the game. This is where I have to admit that Blades of Exile is actually the fourth game in the Exile series. Taking place in a world with high fantasy elements, Exile is a subterranean realm which is basically used as a penal colony for the above-ground capital E Empire. It's basically an underground Australia. So why am I highlighting the fourth game in a series? Well, unlike the other games, creator Jeff Vogel released Blades of Exile as an open source project, as the game is completely incompatible on Vista or any version onward of Windows. Upon releasing the source code, Jeff Vogel wrote on his website, quote, "Doing anything with this code will take work and skill. It is old and outdated. I wrote it early in my career and parts of it are pretty darn clunky," end quote. That's why I'm here, to direct you to other people's work and skill, because this game is 100% free and functional on modern systems, at least up to Windows 10, on bladesofexile.com. I'm sure there's some God of War fans that are pretty upset that this URL is taken. Download it yourself and give it a try, and due to a capable scenario editor, there are community-made maps to download and play, allowing you to experience dozens of more adventures than the 3 offered in the base game. Jeff has both instructions for how to download and play player-made maps, and a rating system for their quality. So that's the story of the game. What's the story in the game? Well, like I said earlier, I'm proud to say that there are no spoilers in this video, because the main stories of the 3 scenarios can be summarized in one sentence. The main plots of the scenarios are incredibly simple, with some frustrating story progression moments, as the simple main plot allows for 2 of the best things about Blades of Exile: the wonderful world with environmental storytelling, and nearly complete decision-making freedom. Is the world ugly and dangerous? Yes, and in the game too. If that doesn't bother you too much, there are oodles of secrets to find, awesome side locations, and fantastic environmental storytelling. There is so much to see in each individual location and in the overworld as a whole, and I discover more secrets every time I play. If there is an area of a map still left unexplored, there's almost certainly a secret. Plus, the entire map is open to you from the beginning. You can go anywhere and do anything with no level-locked areas, only locked off by the difficulty of enemies you'd encounter. Navigation outside of notable locations is done via the overworld, which goes to a small random map for enemy encounters. A lot of games like this have the accursed random encounter, which to me has always felt like it was punishing exploration, especially when paired with tedious combat systems. In Blades of Exile, visible enemy parties will chase you on the overworld for a while, but they are also avoidable. so you can fight as often as you would like in many cases, unless you're in a dungeon. There is great enemy variety, and the low resolution can sometimes add to the intrigue as you don't know exactly what you're even looking at. Depending on where you spend a lot of time, you may end up facing a lot of the same enemies, or stumble across those you haven't seen in dozens and dozens, or even hundreds of hours of play. This spills right into the next thing that Blades does well: complete decision-making freedom. You know those times in many RPGs where a plot-important character is not allowed to die, so they are weirdly immortal or simply get knocked out in combat? Well, there are none of those in Blades of Exile. Everyone can die, and that includes you. This characteristic is at the expense of having a deep story and story-important NPCs, because you really can murder everyone you see. If any of your characters die, though, they permanently die unless you have a super rare and high-level spell. Only one member of your party needs to stay alive to avoid a game over. There is a reputation system within each settlement to stop you from just killing and looting everybody, so try this at your own peril. Admittedly, the impact of these decisions is very shallow. Yes, you can change the fundamental society by staging a coup, killing all the guards, seizing the means of production, and overthrowing the ruling class, but things simply continue as usual, just without those things you eliminated. So this aspect is fun, typically for replay value, but it can lose its luster fairly quickly depending. As mentioned earlier, the characters you play are not important to the story, as all 6 of them are entirely customizable at the beginning of the game. The character customization is fantastic, and I have launched this game back up simply to play with this aspect. When clicking to create a new party, this is the stock party that populates before you customize anything. Thankfully, you can choose whatever names you want. Each member of the party can be customized with specific combat and lore statistics, their own character icon, and with role-playing components as well. Each character can be one of the 3 races, which are the humans, Nephilim, which are cat people, and Slizerikai, which are lizard people. Each race specializes in multiple or a specific type of magic or combat, but can slow leveling up speed like positive traits. To touch on that, each character can have positive or negative traits, granting bonuses or debuffs, but raising or lowering the experience required for a character to get to the next level. So your enfeebled, chronically diseased invalid may be level 7 or 8 by the time your perfect physical specimen hits level 2. Despite what I said about excellent enemy variety, the character icon choices are extremely limited, just this one page. If you want to, you can slip into the character files and create your own icon using a resolution of 28 by 36 pixels on Microsoft Paint, and replacing an existing icon. While Blades of Exile does have difficulty options, you can exaggerate the difficulty of the game from the character creation screen. You do not have to create a full party. You can play the whole game with just a single character or just 2 or 3 for a deluxe Give Me Blades of Exile hard mode. So that's the long and short of Blades of Exile. While a nostalgic favorite for me, Blades of Exile is an obscure, heavily dated, rudimentary game with terrible graphics, sound, and story, but is able to offer gameplay with intuitive mechanics for the time, fairly dynamic turn-based combat that avoids some common genre pitfalls, and an interesting and somehow immersive world to explore. While I certainly cannot recommend this game to most people, Jeff Vogel and Spiderweb Software have continued to make games, so you can always try the Avernum, Avedon, or Geneforge series. But then again, it's free and it's open source, so feel free to give it a try. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to have more content for you soon. Thank you.